Just to introduce myself, I'm Dickie, Director of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. Delighted to have been asked to chair this evening's event. And to kick off really by just on behalf of Parenting in Scotland, Parenting across Scotland, welcoming everybody to the seminar, to the event. Thank you for coming. I realise with such lovely weather out there, it's a bit of a struggle to come indoors, so it's fantastic to see such a full turnout today. Just before I get on with anything else, a few bits of housekeeping. There are no fire alarms planned, so if the fire alarm goes off, we have to make our way down the stairs and out the building. And
to the dome, which is just along the way, same side of the road.
To the dome, but not to go inside, just stand outside. We're filming the event, as people can see, so if anybody has any concerns about being filmed or doesn't want to be filmed, if you could just let the organisers and the cameramen know that. Final thing, if you haven't found the toilets yet, just through the grey doors here, and toilets are there. So we've got a couple of hours before we break into the more informal reception part of the event. We're going to start off, I'll give a bit of an introduction, a bit of background, and then we're going to hear from Professor Brid, Featherstone, and Professor Gupta, telling us about their new book, Protecting Children, a Social Model. We're then going to have a chance for a bit of question and answer, direct just with them, before then hearing from Sally and Kelly, who many of you know, to give a kind of response within the Scottish context and what the book raises, what it says, and what it means in a Scottish context. Then we're going to hear from Claire Simpson from Parenting Across Scotland, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and that's the chance we really get into debate and discussion. And then we'll be finished by 6:30, and there'll be a reception for more sort of social and informal discussion. Hope that all makes sense and everybody knows what's happening. If I can just kick off then, as I said, I'm John Dickie, I'm Director of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. For those of you who don't know me, CPAG is what it sounds like it says. We're a campaigning organisation working for an end to child poverty as part of CPAG UK, working to end child poverty in Scotland and across the UK. We do that by raising awareness of child poverty and the impact it has on children and families. But we've also developed a particular expertise in the social security system and work with many of the organisations that many of you work for to support you, ensure that the families you're working with get the financial support that they're entitled to under the current system. I think it is just worth reminding ourselves before we get into the discussion and the meat of the book we're discussing today, just a bit about the scale of child poverty in Scotland today. We currently have a situation where nearly 1 in 4 of our children are officially recognised as growing up in poverty. 240,000 children across Scotland living in families that don't have adequate incomes, adequate resources to give their children the best start in life. We also know, as data published by End Child Poverty Coalition, that again some of you are members of yesterday, that poverty exists in communities right across Scotland. Not only do we have that extraordinary scale of poverty in Scotland already, all the indicators are, all the forecasts are, that these levels of poverty are going to increase. So whether it's the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IPPR, Resolution Foundation, Scottish Government analysis itself, all showing trajectories for child poverty increasing markedly over the next few years to over 1 in 3 in the next few years, up to nearly 40% of children living in poverty within a decade, unless something substantive happens to change that trajectory. And we also know, and all of you know, particularly those of you working directly with children and families, that these aren't just statistics. These are children too often going hungry, missing out on school activities, missing out on the opportunities that their better off peers take for granted. What's more, these are parents who are going without themselves, going hungry without themselves, missing meals themselves, going without in order to protect their children from the poverty they face. There's no question that the vast majority of parents go to extraordinary lengths to protect their children from that poverty. But despite their best efforts, there's no question that poverty also reduces families' resilience, undermines their capacity, and makes life even more difficult when they're facing many other challenges. Despite this grim backdrop and the kind of the scale of child poverty we're facing, I think we are at a moment of opportunity, particularly here in Scotland. We have a government and parliament that has set statutory targets towards the eradication of child poverty by 2030. We have a government that's brought forward a delivery plan setting out how it plans to work towards those targets, a delivery plan that recognises very clearly and explicitly the structural drivers of poverty. This is about raising family incomes, reducing the costs that those families face. We also have a new statutory duty on local authorities and health boards to be producing local child poverty action reports that should be bringing together local policies, local practices, local services, including children's services, including child protection, together to be setting out the actions that are being taken locally towards meeting those national child poverty targets. So I think it really is, it's in this moment of opportunity that an event like this and the discussion of this book today is so timely. This is a book that describes how child protection needs to be understood in that wider context. There's no question that as the state rolls back its wider support for families, removes the services and social security that protects children in its widest sense, it's absolutely vital that child protection and children's services policy and practice is underpinned and informed by a real understanding of poverty and its impact on children and families. I don't want to preempt anymore what Brid and Anna are going to say, because we have the authors of the book here with us today, and I'm delighted that they've travelled up to join us. So without further ado, I think Anna's going to speak first, and then pass over to Brid.
Thank you. I'm Anna Gupta. I'm Professor of Social Work at Royal Holloway, London University, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to this beautiful city, and particularly when the sun is shining. It's great. So I'm going to start off the presentation, and then Brid is going to follow. I'm really going to start off with critiquing the current system and really why we've written this book, why we think it's important to think about developing a social model, and then Brid will take over and talk much more about the social model and how we outline it in the book. Okay, let me just, hopefully this will work, yeah. So, just starting off, really talking about stories and the power of stories. And stories are the means by which we navigate the world. They allow us to interpret its complexity and contradictory signals. George Monbiot talks a lot about that. And, stories have compelling stories have plots, feature villains, have moral appeal, victims as well, and appeal to particular values. What we're arguing in the book is that parents and children in the child protection system in the UK deserve better stories than those that are currently being told. And we need to develop compelling stories rooted in evidence and appeal to alternative values than those that are dominant at the moment. So our aim is really to begin the dialogue that tries to shift and change some of these stories, and in the process to reframe child welfare. And it's the beginning of a process, it's part of a dialogue. We're not saying here that we've got all the answers. This is about really thinking how we can do things differently, and in our view, thinking how we can do things much more humanely and much more in line with social justice. So, the current child protection story in the UK. we argue, is that the harms children and young people need protecting from are seen as being normally located within individual families and caused by the actions or actions of omission or commissions or inactions of parents or other caregivers, with the implication that they have choice about these actions. And parents' inactions and actions are due to factors ranging from poor attachment, patterns, faulty learning styles, poor and dangerous choices, to use substances or not, for example, and that interventions are primarily concerned with protecting children in individual families, as individual home visits, and identifying what distinguishes this family from others in similar circumstances, rather than identifying broader, wider issues, common challenges that many parents face, challenges such as poverty, such as debt, such as poor housing. And also, what's a major part of the story is the idea about risk assessment, and that experts, risk assessments, procedures, multi-agency working are central to protecting children, are the answer often. So we're arguing that this is a very limited story and that we need to disturb and disrupt this story. So this story is occurring within austerity Britain. As you said, I just took it from the Child Poverty Action website in Scotland. Almost 4 children are living in poverty in Scotland. And there's increasing hardship for many families across Britain. Universal credit problems, homelessness, food bank use increasing, local authority budgets have been cut, family support services closed. There are high thresholds, social workers under pressure, certainly with some of the budget cuts to local authorities, and what has developed is a highly risk-averse context, we argue. The majority of children are not on child protection plans or on the child protection register for physical or sexual abuse. They are for neglect, for emotional abuse. And we argue that this is particularly intertwined and interlinked with poverty. Emotional abuse is often used to categorise children who are living in situations of where there's domestic abuse or mental health problems. And certainly in England, it's 83% last year of children on child protection plans were there for neglect and emotional abuse. So really, physical and sexual abuse being much more marginal categories now. And also, what's certainly in England, numbers have skyrocketed, have certainly gone up and increased a great deal, as have children coming into care. I was looking at the Scotland data, and we can talk about this later, you don't seem to have had the same spike as we've had in the last 5 or 6 years, or 8 years certainly in England. And we can, it'd be useful to think about that as well. But across the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, a large-scale study that Brid was involved with, and that Janice was involved with, and if anyone else is involved in here, apologies for not identifying you, the Child Welfare Inequalities Project found that deprivation was a major factor for children on child protection plans and in care in the 4 countries of the UK, and particularly high rates of children in Scotland coming into care in out-of-home care from deprived communities. So that's the context in which the child protection story that I've just previously talked about, with an individualised risk model, is happening while many families' lives are very challenging and are very difficult, and are then being caught up in the child protection and the court systems. So, paradoxically, although we know most children on child protection plans and care are from poor backgrounds, poverty is largely invisible in policy and practice, we argue. And instead there's very individualised risk discourses, little attention to social determinants of harm or social contexts of family lives. Kate Morris, again part of the Child Welfare Inequalities Projects, did some qualitative work in both England and in Scotland. And I'd really recommend reading her article in Child and Family Social Work with others. And they found tackling poverty and inequality is often not seen as the core business for child protection workers and policymakers. Instead, the core business is risk assessments or assessments of parenting capacity. She says, she argues in the paper, the admin paper, that poverty is a wallpaper of practice, like it's too big to tackle and too familiar to notice. I think also really worryingly, I think what they found in the study is that not all, but there was a majority of social workers where there was an underlying underclass discourse going through their work with families living in poverty. So again, it's a blame in individualised risk factors, that are taking away the sort of structural and social harm factors in terms of people's work and how they understand families' lives. Okay, so just linked to Child Welfare Inequalities Project, but led by Paul Bywater. It's a really interesting study that I'd recommend people look at if they haven't already. It's a literature review about the relationship between poverty and child abuse and neglect. And I suppose briefly, they found that poverty is neither necessary nor sufficient factor in the occurrence of child abuse and neglect. Because many families were not in poverty, many children who are not in poverty will experience child abuse and neglect in some form, and many children and families living in poverty don't experience child abuse and neglect. And there can be many factors, but really crucially, poverty is one factor, but what they found in the literature review is that it's perhaps the most pervasive and interwoven. And certainly what we argue is rather than talking about direct causation, so why are you neglecting your children, your neighbour down the road, isn't that sort of argument. Think about systemic causation and how it interacts with other factors such as domestic abuse, which Rachel mentioned, mental health, child sexual exploitation, particularly in the vulnerability of young people to sexual exploitation. It's very complex, it's circulatory, the factors. And I think importantly, thinking about systemic causation requires us to move away from models of assessment that focus on risk, on individual blame, responsibility, to thinking in contextual terms, in much more interactive, dynamic ways about families' lives. We're not saying it's all about social, it's about psychological and social. It's both and. But what we're arguing is that the focus needs to be shifted. The focus has very much been and developed on internal psychological factors with the absence of looking at the interactions with social factors and social harms to children and families. Just mental health, there's lots that we can learn from the mental health literature and practice. And there is increasingly thought given to the social determinants of mental ill health. A study for the World Health Organization talks about levels of mental health distress among communities needs to be understood less in terms of individual pathology and more in a response to relative deprivation and social injustice, which erode the emotional, spiritual, intellectual resources essential for psychological well-being. There's a really good organisation, and again, I'm not sure if it's in Scotland or not, but it is in England, and it might well have branches in Scotland. It's worth checking out. Psychologists for Social Change, and they're talking about austerity elements and the impact, on issues of humiliation and shame, of distrust, fear, instability, insecurity, isolation, loneliness, that many of the families that we're working with are experiencing in these times, and that how poverty and inequality, hardship causes trauma, but it also exacerbates past trauma, and we need to be thinking about those links as well. So just a few examples. Certainly, this is from a parent who I worked with in an organisation called ATD Fourth World, an anti-poverty organisation. It does have a branch in, I think, Glasgow. And they work with families often who have had involvement with child protection or court services. And just explains, poverty is living day to day and making ends meet. The money you have is not enough to provide for your kids. My daughter was bullied at school for her clothes and not having the right fashion. She stopped attending school. I was threatened with prison. I don't like borrowing from family and friends. I asked for help from social services. Then a social worker came round to check my cupboards, made me feel I'd done the wrong by asking. This was a story that was repeated and repeated by the families that I spoke to. And they talked about disappearing help, being frightened to seek support because of getting a risk-averse, punitive response. Particularly, women who might be experiencing domestic abuse were really worried about their children being removed, or mental health problems that they would be labelled and stigmatised. There have been a number of studies talking to parents, Brid and Kate, Morris done one, I've done a number with particularly with ATD Fourth World, and the adoption inquiry that Brid and I did, and talking to families that have been involved in child protection, family court system. This, our work complements what other studies have done, what other families are telling us. It's not rocket science what families want and what they need, what they identify. It's very similar. Being listened to, being cared about, practical support, material help, kindness comes out quite a lot. Respect, honesty, empathy. Very similar message coming through all the time. But also, as I said, families talking about fear and blame throughout the system, and that impacting on the relationships able to be developed with social workers. That risk has replaced need. That they're assessed but not supported. Social worker for the child and the adoption inquiry that came through by parents as and by lawyers as a damning sort of statement in terms of what it means to the parents when a lot of when some social workers say that. So it can be a way of impeding relationships, making parents feel they're unimportant, but also of not providing the practical support to try and access housing, to try and sort out benefits, for example, because I'm here for the child, that's your benefit. They found material hardship, poor housing not acknowledged, the toxic trio, a number of studies that we've done pick that out. Criticism of how it's used, the sort of mental health, domestic abuse, and domestic mental health and substance misuse. And how, firstly, I think it's just used so often without any attention to, for example, what and how much. Is it a few spliffs in the evening, or is it a crack cocaine habit? Is it depression or a full-blown psychotic illness? But importantly also, it's individualised risky behaviours, often detached from the social determinants of harm, that are causing some of it, that are interacting with other factors to cause some of these problems. Some of the quotes, just from family members. The children are part of families. The social worker cannot only be the social worker for the child. And what came out a lot when I talked to the ATD families, which is really depressing, that in care proceedings, use of food banks was used against them. They were criticised for using food banks. And you think, well, keep your child hungry, you'll get food. Really, quite blaming stuff. Okay, so also, I suppose linked to what we found in our research, what we talk about in the book, we're not alone in this, I think. And we need to make alliances, we need to join, we need to talk with each other within the profession of social work and outside of it. Certainly in the adoption inquiry, we found evidence of social workers doing ethics work, linking what they were doing to wider political, social context, but in the process also experiencing moral distress, experiencing quite a lot of distress about the context in which they were working and what they weren't able to do for families and support families, and the impact on this, on retention, on recruitment, on practice in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, we also found quite a sort of element of fatalism about what can we do about it. We're in this situation, we're in this context. But certainly there was an appetite amongst some of the social workers that talked to us to talk about this and to actually think through the ethical implications. There is continuing discussion and challenge about some of the trends in relation to technical rational approaches, particularly predictive AI, that's happening in local authorities. Certainly in England, again, I'm not sure about Scotland in terms of identifying children in need. Just talking about actually what relationship-based work means in a context where there are fragmented systems, there's silos, you're the child social worker, and then you're the adopted social worker or the fostering social worker, and children moving through fragmented systems, silos within the whole system. Changes of workers, recruitment issues, and impact of continuing funding cuts, a lot of privatisation from a range of service users, and increasingly, both in England and in Scotland, parliamentary groups are identifying some of the real difficulties around the funding cuts to social services. There's been in England the ADCS, Local Government Association, are really challenging ridiculous budgets that they've got and how they are not able to meet their needs, and certainly I think there's some discussion about that in Scotland which we can pick up. So there are, there's a lot of people that are thinking we need change, and part of this is trying to build alliances, create spaces for dialogue in terms of what we can do, and I think that's me. Yeah.
As Anna says, we have been through our research, the Child Welfare Inequalities Project, which kind of gives a very strong look at trends across the UK, but also through all the qualitative research we've done. We've been challenging and disrupting a story, a very individualistic story, that in its modern version actually is rooted in the 60s, rooted in and led by paediatricians who were concerned to stop babies being battered and dying, and actually has morphed alarmingly to encompass, as Anna said, neglect, emotional abuse. The child protection, if you like, industry has shown a remarkable ability to colonise a whole range of family troubles and human tragedies and put them under a very, as Anna said, narrow, individualistic, risk-focused rubric. And so we want to change the story. In that process, the work of Rebecca Solnit, who's a climate change activist and a feminist from the States, has been very influential. And she argues that changing the story is not enough in itself, but it actually has often historically been foundational to real changes. I won't read out the whole quote, but she talks about making injuries visible and public. And that by making them public, by naming them, she's a really big thing about calling things by their real names in her latest book. And she says that what every conflict is about is in part a battle over the story we tell, but crucially who tells the story and who is heard. And in our book, we have really tried, as a result of our own work, particularly Anna's work with ATD Fourth World, but also the work we did in the adoption inquiry and work I've been doing with Kate with families. We are trying to promote and open up new stories, because the dominant stories about the child protection system have been from experts. and they've been from people working in it. And what we're saying is we need to hear from the people who experience it. And just to give you a little snapshot of that, there are 2 stories that I always carry around with me and really affected me and made me really think that we are not doing this right. We really need to think about it. And one was a woman I spoke to when I evaluated the advice line for the family rights group, and apologies to people in this room who've heard me tell this story before, but it bears retelling. I was evaluating the advice line, and the remit from the family rights group was to find out from people who use their advice line, you know what people ring up and they need help, they're involved with children's services, and they get help from trained advisors. And what the family rights group wanted me to find out was, were the advice workers good? Were they doing their job? What I got instead was a litany of pain and hurt and trauma about families' experiences of children's services. They constantly said to me, oh, the advice workers are fine. One sentence, they're brilliant. My problem is, and I just want to tell you about, I call her Julia, I called her other names. Julia was my mother's name, so I don't know why Julia has got attached to this woman. I rang Julia, and she she'd rung the advice line because her children had been put on a child protection register, as it was called then. And she said she'd been in care, she'd experienced sexual abuse in home, and she'd also been abused in care. And then, in what is tragically an all too common story, she'd come out of care and she'd got involved with a man who had been domestically abusive. And she had managed to get away from him and to look after the children, but she was depressed. Probably understandably. Maybe this wouldn't be too unexpected. Cumulative trauma, terrible poverty. And she rang Children's Services for help. And to link in with Anna's theme, they turned her story of needing help into a story of risk. They put her children on the child protection plan. And she said to me, do you know what? I've been bullied all my life, and this is more of it. And that was a really important, I won't tell the other story, a minute later. That was a really important story in helping me to think, I think we could be doing this better. I think we could be taking people's stories of needing help and suffering from trauma and pain and doing something better with it. So, we want to change the story. I've already mentioned, Anna's already mentioned George Monbiot, the climate change activist. He has argued that you shouldn't really take away someone's story without giving them a new one. Doesn't mean it has to be a perfect one. It doesn't mean that it can't be provisional and open to challenge, and we certainly would say we are open to challenge. But he does say you can only change things if you're saying there is another way of doing this, there is another story. And that's what we're trying to do with ours. But why the social model? There's loads of holes in it. Why didn't we go for public health, for example? There are lots of synergies in our work with the public health approach. Well, the reason that we went for the social model, and we have to thank Jo Warner in particular, who we did some work with and did an article with, who does a lot of work in mental health. And she alerted us to a lot of developments there. The reason we went for this is that the social model in its history has opened up thinking beyond, for example, for people with disabilities, it opened up thinking beyond what can I not do as an individual? What do I need to get help from an expert for? What is wrong with me? What stops me from doing the things I want? And it starts to open up discussions about how can I live in this society when it puts barriers in place where I need to go to study, when it makes it impossible for me to get on a bus, when it makes it impossible for me to navigate a whole range of public spaces. So it turned the gaze away from the individual and from what she couldn't do, and it started a massive conversation in society about how do you create an enabling society. And crucially as well, the reason that we like the social model is it was led by people who experienced disabilities themselves. In alliance with academics, in alliance with professionals, but it was led, and it kind of said to the doctors and to the professionals, you're not in charge of telling our story. We want you to hear what we think we need. And we think this is a vital project for those concerned with, we need to move away from thinking, what's wrong with this family? What are the risk issues in this family? How can we communicate better to ensure that the children are protected? And we need to start to say, What do we need? What do we need? What are the barriers to ensuring in Scotland, in Wales, in England, in Northern Ireland? What are the economic, the environmental, the cultural barriers to ensuring that children are cared for safely and that wherever possible they stay safely within their families, therefore respecting their relational needs and identities? So basically it's turning the gaze away from the individual, and we'll come back to some of the problems with that in a minute, but it's starting to say, so it challenges, for example in England, it challenges a disconnect where at the level of the government, the Department for Education will say, we have poured millions into protecting children, we've developed all these practice methodologies, and at the same time, the same government in a different department is responsible for more and more children coming into care, and coming into poverty, and more families having to use food banks. So it says there's a disconnect here. You have to think across the piece. The other thing, as I've already indicated, is the social model allows for new storytellers, and it allows for marginalised stories to become possible and to become heard. And this is really crucial. So, key elements of the social model, and I'll do my best to be as brief as possible. There are more, and since we wrote the book, I probably would write these differently, but what we talk about is tackling root causes, and I'll go through them. Rethinking the role of the state, something I've become obsessed with actually, really rethinking how we develop more a different social settlement for the 21st century. Relationships-based practice and co-production, and finally, but very importantly, embedding ethics and human rights in our dialogues in everyday practices. So very quickly, tackling root causes. We've talked a lot about poverty and inequality. It's very important to acknowledge that poverty and inequality are to acknowledge the whole issue around intersectionality, to look at how inequality is experienced by women, by people from different minority ethnic populations, by people with disabilities, and to look at the intersections between different kinds of inequalities. This is a really big project, and one of the things that we're very anxious about is that we don't think this is a project just for practitioners alone. We actually think that it's absolutely crucial that we commit as a whole system to thinking about how, if you're living in Edinburgh as a mum on her own with her 3 kids, what is needed across the piece to make that life, a good life, a life of flourishing, a life of safety for a mother on her own with her children. What's needed in terms of transport, what's needed in terms of money, what's needed in terms of social supports, etc. We think that means we have to reframe and connect up policies at the national and local levels. We watched with horror as the fire tore through Grenfell Tower a few years ago, and those of us in the know in child protection in England also knew that at the same time as the council was not able to safeguard children sleeping in their beds, it had received an outstanding from Ofsted for its children's services, and we thought, we have to challenge that disconnect. We have to reconnect policies. We have to say that what happens in one bit of the system really makes a difference across the whole piece. So, and it requires us to confront some entrenched elephant traps, and Anna has already started talking about those. So it requires us to, when we're telling the story, to open up discussion about what have been very tricky subjects. And we were talking about this with John from CPAG before the meeting. So there are 3 things that we need to talk about. When we're tackling root causes, are we saying people should never take personal responsibility for their behaviours and for how they look after their children? Are we really saying it's all about the big picture and the big structures? Are we, as Anna said, how do we engage with the question around causation? Not all poor people neglect or harm their children, not all smokers get lung cancer, etc., etc. And I'll come back to all of these. And thirdly, interlinked, of course, is, are you really, and this has been, we've been really told off about this one, are you really justifying the terrible things that parents do to their children? So I'll go through those quickly. So there is a danger, and we say this in the introduction to the book, that we simply invert the status quo and substitute an underdog story. A story actually that robs families really of agency, of vitality, of richness, that says they are merely reductive ciphers, that they just take in what happens to them and they have no choices or responsibility about it and they have no agency. And we're not saying that. We're also not saying that asking people to take responsibility for their situation is problematic. Again, you know, in all our lives, in all our everyday experiences, we all go around expecting from each other and from the wider society that we take responsibility. And the example I always give is, if you have a friend who you want to meet for coffee, but every time they're late or they don't turn up or there's some excuse, after a while you start to feel like, well, maybe they don't really want to see me, or maybe they're really bad timekeepers, but you start to feel like, I wish they would take responsibility for their behaviour. And if they always blame something, the buses are always late, or, you know, their boss was a pain or whatever. So we're not saying that asking people to take responsibility for their situation is problematic. In fact, we think it's essential in terms of our identities as human beings. But we are saying it is problematic when we expect individuals to resolve problems for which they cannot reasonably be held responsible. And there's a story Anna always tells which just completely breaks my heart, about a man in London who had who'd only recently got leave to remain in London, in the most expensive city in the UK, and probably one of the most expensive cities in terms of housing in the world. And he was assessed to be a good carer for his 3 children, but because he couldn't find suitable housing for 3 children, because he had no credit record and because it's a really expensive city, he was seen as not being sufficiently committed to that. So that's what we're saying is problematic, where we really get our understanding of responsibility hopelessly confused, and we expect people to do impossible things. The track 2, as Anna has always said, is the difference between direct and systemic causation. We've been very influenced by the work of a framing theorist called George Lakoff, who people in the poverty world have been hearing a lot about, and his work has been used up here. And I think very quickly, the reason that I've been looking at that work, or we've been looking at it, is that we do know that it's not enough to just kind of tell people the facts and then they'll go away and change their behaviour. We do know that people respond to how things are framed and how they're told. And one of the big traps for people who want to change the world from a progressive position is that often what they're talking about are quite complex things. So Donald Trump is a master of direct causation and of using stories brilliantly. He's actually, sadly for us, a brilliant storyteller. So he will say, I will build a wall and I will stop immigration. Progressives say, actually immigration is really complex. There are a range of factors and people yawn and turn away. But Lakoff says that direct causation is really easy to communicate, and in fact he says that in every language in the world there is a grammar for direct causation. So and it's because every one of us probably has had to tell a child, a baby, or a little toddler, if you put your hand in the fire, it'll get burnt. It's a direct causation for it. There's no question about it. However, most things are really difficult, particularly in social life. So, for example, if we say to people, or I'd say to my niece, if you work hard, you'll get a good job. Today, that's not so clear-cut, actually. She may have done the wrong degree, she may be in the wrong city, she may have been subject to Ireland falling apart in the global recession again, so no matter how hard she works, she may not get a good job. So a range of things will come into play. That's really hard to explain to people when you're trying to tell a different story, but it is crucial that we learn how to tell this. The third one is about justification. Are you saying poverty or gender norms or gender socialisation justifies violence or neglect? We are not saying that. We understand the challenge, but it confuses explanation with justification. And this is the work of Andrew Sayre, which is really excellent on this work, on this stuff. He argues a lot of behaviour lacks moral justification, but is nevertheless more or less likely because of particular circumstances. So if you under-regulate the financial system, it doesn't justify what the bankers do, it just makes them more likely. So again, it's about, and this is hard to do, and it's hard when people are using tropes like, well, people should stop drinking so much and they should get smaller televisions, or they should stop giving their kids telephones, or they shouldn't take them on holidays and fill them with sweets. So the second thing that we need, how am I doing for time?
I think you're fine.
Oh, right, okay. So we think the role of the state, there's loads of work going on in this now as we confront the fact that the beverage welfare state constructed after the post-war is creaking at its seams, is challenged by rising inequality, by climate change, and by a growing concern across the piece about how power is distributed. Brexit is an obvious example of the latter. In our book, we argue for a strong state in terms of social protections. We do think there is a really clear role for the state in relation to housing, in relation to income, and in relation to education and health and all those things. However, and we do go along though with the new thinkers who are saying our state has become too transactional, it's become very business oriented, it's been infected by new public managerialism, and it's too centralised, it's too top down. And at a very local level, when you think about it, particularly in England, where we have social workers now in city centre offices, miles away from the areas that they work in, we have become far too remote and too centralised. Okay, all right, I'm just going to finish. The other thing that we argue about is we've outsourced the responsibility for protecting children to experts, i.e. social workers. So when I see somebody struggling on my street, I go to the NSPCC website and what does it tell me to do? It tells me to ring children's services. It never says to me go around and make sure they're okay, have a cup of tea with them. We also think that we need to move into a more community-based approach, to move beyond these top-down programs that we throw into communities and that then leaving people disenchanted and leaving them frustrated. This is a quote from Becca Dove, and I think it's a really helpful one. If we help a family for 6 months, and who does these days, and we do one home visit a week for 2 hours, and who does these days, the family would spend 52 hours with the worker. They'd spend 2,860 hours in and with their community. We need to go back to understanding the capacities that communities have to support families, but also to impede them. So I'm going to stop, I'm afraid. Co-production, I'm going to stop. Yeah, just basically, it's not just about us rethinking what services we offer, but and this is really hard, Claire and I were talking about this at lunch, there's no easy answers here. We need to start to plan services with families. We need to say to families, what's it like to live here, and what do you need to live well? And how can we support each other to live together? So we need to dethrone the expert, and we need to stop outsourcing the responsibility for child protection to experts, crucially in this case social workers, and we need to start thinking about what do we need to live well as a community and what do our children need. There were just a few other things. This is just a quote for us, I use it all the time, and we use it in the book. Child protection is not about technical fixes, it's not about checklists, it's about the really big questions, the questions that keep us awake at night. What is it to live a good life? What is it to construct a good society? And what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind?
Thank you very much.